But we've got another 20 minutes. So I want to talk about the philosophy of and political filming as well.
Yep.
So the next, was this what led you on to the Doon?
Briefly, indirectly, yes. The next project I did was without Judith, because Judith and I had done Photowalas jointly. But I was asked to make a film in Sardinia by the Ethnographic Institute there. And they had presumably asked me because they wanted a film made about mountain shepherds by a complete outsider who would bring a different perspective to the subject. And the director of the Institute believed that most of the films that had been made about shepherds were rather stereotyped, and he wanted a fresh approach, and he had seen some of my films. So that more or less took up the next 2 years of my life. And
what did that end up with?
And that's a film called Tempos de Baristas. And eventually we made that as a co-production with BBC. Which is one of the few times, in fact, that there has been television money involved, in my films. I was very lucky that I happened to be about to make that film just at the point at which the BBC was putting on a series called Fine Cut. And the commissioning editor was Andre Singer. First of all, because British television rarely showed long documentaries, and this was meant to be a feature-length documentary. And secondly, of course, because I think my type of filmmaking didn't follow the usual formats of television. But I walked into Andre Singer's office, discussed it with him, and within about a half an hour, he had agreed to co-finance the production. And that allowed me, with the money from the Institute, to spend much longer on it, to take my time, to be able to work in the way that I like to work. And also, incidentally, to hire Di Vaughan as editor, who had worked with us on Photowalas, and from whom I learned a tremendous amount about editing, and I wanted to work with him again.
He's a very famous editor, of course.
He's a very famous, probably the finest editor of documentary in British television, I would say, and also a very fine writer on cinema, and also now a novelist. I mean, he's published 4 or 5 novels. First one published when he was 60. So he was a wonderful person to work with. But apart from Di, we really haven't worked with other editors. I mean, there's one other occasion, but...
Do you edit your own films then?
Yes, yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and have ever since Tempos de Baristas. And of course we edited many of the Aboriginal studies films also ourselves. So that project finished in 94, I believe. Yeah, and the film went out in 94. We actually made a slightly longer version of the film than the BBC broadcast. The one they put to air was, I think, 90 minutes, and the version, I suppose you could call it the director's cut, was 100 minutes, which is the version I prefer, because to make the BBC version, I think we had to take out the 4 scenes that perhaps I prized the most in the film, but that weren't absolutely essential to the framework, the kind of skeleton on which the film hung. So that finished, and then the next project was the Doon School project, and that occurred because I was contacted by an Indian anthropologist named Sanjay Srivastava, who was completing his PhD on 4 schools of northern India. And although he'd been raised and educated in, yeah, Sanjay was educated and raised in India, but he was doing his PhD at Sydney University. And he just got in touch with me and he said, do you think this is a subject that would lend itself to ethnographic filmmaking? And we had a number of discussions after that, and I thought it would, that it would be a very interesting proposition to look at a school in this way, particularly a residential school. So we had various ideas about collaboration on projects, but in the end he got a lectureship and went off to teach, and I ended up doing the project. When I visited the school for the first time, and it's very close to where we had filmed Photowalas, I must say. I knew the area. I had heard of the school. I had visited some other schools in the district. And I went and met the headmaster. And you can imagine that, many heads of institutions, particularly schools, might be somewhat threatened by the idea of a filmmaker coming in and making a film about their institution. But he was remarkably open and welcoming. And he said, if you did this, it would give us a different perspective on ourselves, which would be very valuable. And he also said that, these students, their education is very word-based. They study Shakespeare and they read lots of books, but they're not really very critical about visual images. And despite the fact that they're surrounded by television when they go home, they go to the movies, and everywhere around them are images in advertising, in public media. And he said it would be very good for them to have a filmmaker around, because it would raise their consciousness about how film works on them, in a sense, how they're affected by it, and they'd learn to read films better. So when I walked out of his office, I more or less suddenly had a project, having thought perhaps there might be a possibility here. When I walked in, I'd more or less committed myself to coming back. And I found I was able to do this work now on a fairly small budget, because by this time digital video had come in, and it suddenly made possible the sort of filmmaking that we'd been doing before, but at a much cheaper price.
And what sort of cameras did you use?
I started with a Sony Model 200, which was one of their first DV cameras. It was actually a DV cam format, and it was a sort of medium-sized camera that you held on your shoulder. I should say that Doon School is probably the most famous school in India, and it's an elite school. It's a boys' boarding school, and it was one of the 3 schools that Sanjay had written about and studied. The other 2 were Mayo College in Rajasthan and Lawrence School, which is up in the hills. And what happened next? Well, one thing that happened, we were actually talking about the possibilities that digital video opened up, because in addition to making it much cheaper to make films, it suddenly permitted one-person filmmaking in a way that 16 had not. I had actually made one film alone with 16, and it was, you know, it was a kind of technological nightmare to record sound and shoot with 16 millimeter at the same time, and you were constantly in the back of a car changing magazines or changing batteries in microphones and this sort of thing. But digital video convinced me that I could work alone, and in the context of a boys' boarding school, it really didn't seem that appropriate to have, you know, to work as a husband and wife team, just because of the sort of access that you needed to have. I had actually made a kind of verbal agreement with ABC Television and BBC to do a film on Doon School, but at a certain point BBC pulled out. I think primarily because they'd had a change in commissioning editors, and the new commissioning editor looked at the project, and I'd written to him and said, you know, what's happening? Can we proceed with this? And he wrote back and said, well, it was sort of a one-line reply saying, this has been tried before and it never really works, and we're not really interested. So that was actually a blessing, because it liberated me in a way, and not to have to think in television terms. And with my, you know, university research budget, I was able to pay the costs, which were largely a few airplane tickets back and forth, and the cost of tape, which was negligible, and the equipment was provided by my research budget, or by the university, was already there. So I was able to go into the Doon project without having to say, I will make such and such a film of such and such a length, and outline everything that would be in it, or that I hoped would be in it. And I was very open to the possibility that it might be one very long film, or it might be 25 10-minute films. I wanted to see what the situation would throw up, and so I began working on a film which eventually became this film called Doon School Chronicles. It's a quite long film. It's over 2 hours. It's divided into 10 chapters. It's a kind of framing film, perhaps, for the others that I made later. And it looks at the ideology of the school as well as the experiences of some of the sort of protagonists of different ages. You know, there's one who's a new boy in the school. There's another who's sort of midway through, about 14, 15 years old, and another who's 16, 17 years old. And they represent different personalities, different responses to the school, and different age groups. Part of the quid pro quo of allowing me to film at the school was that I would train some student filmmakers. And I did do that with a group of about 8, I think, who for a while turned out a kind of fortnightly film magazine, a video magazine. And that was shown to the school on movie nights, you know, when they showed another film. They made a number of episodes of that. And then they dropped the camera, the school camera, in the river, and that put an end to it for a while. But that remained quite a separate activity from my work, and I kept them quite separate. Also in that first film, I was interested in looking at school texts, that is, texts that I found in the school archives, in the school newspaper, statements that I eventually used as epigraphs for each of the 10 chapters in the film. So it combines text with a kind of observational cinema approach in some cases, in other cases a kind of more participatory approach, and some interview material. I also began experimenting, inserting still images from time to time, just to see how that would give you a different perspective on what you were seeing in the film, how it would make you as an audience stand back and see things differently when you suddenly froze the image. And with these digital cameras, it's very easy to do that. The video cameras, you push a different button,
Yes.
and you can get a 20-second still frame.
Yeah.
And that's really what led me to start doing that. Then I went on and I made 4 more films, and they become progressively more narrowly focused. So the next films deal with smaller groups of primarily first-year students, and the final film is a portrait of one student. And my rationale, I think, was that through the first-year students who were discovering the school for the first time and learning its rules, and we as an audience could more or less coattail, on them and discover the school with them. At least that was the thinking behind that. Doon School Chronicles was, in a way, a product of a change of direction in my own thinking, because I had originally gone to the school with the idea that here are students coming from different parts of the country meeting here. It's a kind of crossing point. And they represent different religions, because Doon is it's a very secular school, and it has Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Jains, a few Christians. It's really varied in that sense. In terms of class and caste, no, it would tend to be more middle class, upper middle class, and upper caste probably, or well,
Caste.
yeah. And what I realized when I came to the school was how homogeneous it was, in a sense, and how strong were its traditions, its rituals. It had been modeled on, the model of the British public school, with some modifications, Indian modifications. And it had been created to really train a generation of Indian leaders who would take over from the British after independence. So the function of the school, in a sense, was to feed people into the governing elites and other elites of India. And it stressed, therefore, leadership, independence, self-confidence, being an all-rounder who was able to get on with all sorts of people, do different things. All very good in themselves, but in other ways it was rather more regimented and controlled. And I remember seeing, I've written something about this, but I remember when I had been at the school for a few weeks feeling, I'm in the middle of a stage play somehow. This is a drama being enacted for somebody. Because a bell would ring, people would rush onto the stage, or dressed in a particular uniform, another bell would ring, they'd disappear. An hour later they'd appear in a completely new uniform for some other function, and I began to think, is it possible to look at a small-scale community like this in the way that you would look at a small-scale society? Or even bring some of the tools of art criticism or literary criticism to this? Could you look at a school as a creative work in some sense? And that in turn led me to begin thinking about the sort of aesthetic that was prominent in the school, the social aesthetic of the school. And so that influences some of the decisions made in making that first film. Trying to look at the rituals, the various patterns of gesture, of speech, behavior, of the physical setting, in fact, that creates a very specific cultural environment and physical environment that people come into and become attuned to and reproduce and so forth. And the other films are less explicitly about that, but that's still somehow in the background, that idea of social aesthetics. So I went on to make films that focused on certain individuals and groups, primarily in the first year.
How long were you actually in the school?
Over a period of about 3 or 4 years. I was there perhaps 12 or 14 months. For periods up to 4 months at a time.
Well, two obvious questions. One is, did you ever have any really serious problems? I mean, you did this in British boarding schools now with the atmosphere of terror and fear of abuse and the rest of it. Filming privately in dormitories and so on and so on. There might be awkward moments and investigations and so on. Were there any problems?
No, not at all. I think that sort of sense of that climate of fear wasn't present to begin with. We're talking about 1998 or 97 when I began, through about 2000. And I don't think it didn't really exist in India, that anxiety.
Which is now existing in Australia in serious ways, you know.
Yeah, and I still don't find it in India, in fact, particularly.
No.
But I think these films could probably never have been made in Britain or in Australia, simply because the conditions of my project were that I had the permission of the school. The board of governors of the school had been consulted and had agreed to let me do a long-term research project in the school using video. But I didn't have to, for example, go through a procedure of getting written permissions from 500 sets of parents. I think that would have been absolutely impossible.
Which you would in a British.
Yeah, and so probably, it would be impossible to make films like this here.
The second question was there anything that really particularly shocked, surprised, or amazed you in the filmmaking about the place? Was it sometimes when you're in the anthropological situation in very different societies, something stands out as surprising?
Particularly surprising. I don't think so. I don't think there was anything that particularly shocked me or surprised me. I think there were a lot of parallels with other schools that my own boarding school had prepared me in some ways for many of the things that went on. I mean, there were the sort of classic problems of teasing, bullying, ragging that went on under the surface and that I would catch glimpses of from time to time that boys told me about, and some pretty bad things, in fact, happened, and various kinds of abuse, physical, sexual, psychological, all these things were there, but they're probably there in many schools. I found that the school tried to account for almost every minute of the students' time, and they ended up being quite stressed, especially toward the end of a term when they'd been just going non-stop for 4 months, and I think the school itself was trying to find solution to this, because it was a case of more and more opportunities, in a way, being presented to the students, being piled on, but many of them, you'd find they were obliged to be in two places at the same time for two things they'd agreed to do. And we're constantly running back and forth. And there was a complex sort of bizarre punishment system, which I didn't find shocking, I found interesting, which again is reproduced in other schools. And the most common form was what they call change in break, where you have to run back to your dormitory, change out of one uniform into another, run back, have a chit signed, run back, change into perhaps a third uniform, run back, have another chit signed, etc. All done in the mid-morning break, this sort of thing. And I mean, there were certain things that stood out. For example, the preoccupation with clothing I found very interesting, which is, that demonstrates, and the elaborate system for, simply handling the amount of clothing, laundering it, getting it back to the students, and the way in which it was accompanying all the changes of various activities within the school. You definitely wore a particular uniform for a particular activity. That was, of course, part of this social aesthetic, certainly, that I was interested in.
Perhaps we ought to move on to, this has got to about 2001 or something like this, 2002. Is there one further phase of filmmaking on another theme to add in, or?
Well, there are two further phases that are on a related theme, I would say. The first is that after finishing the Doon project, the last film was edited in 2003. I began filming at a school in South India called the Rishi Valley School. And it's a very different type of school. Although it's a boarding school, it's coeducational. It starts from a slightly earlier age, and it's based on the ideas of Krishnamurti and his general philosophy, but also his ideas about education. And so it has a kind of progressive educational philosophy, which was actually very similar to the one at Putney School where I went. All you had to do was substitute John Dewey for Krishnamurti, and you had a very similar outlook in many ways. So I began filming there as a kind of counterweight to the Doon project, and I've made two long films there and several shorter ones which are actually in collaboration with students, sort of projects in observation, in fact. And then, as a third project, I began filming and living at a shelter for homeless children in New Delhi. So, in fact, I have 3 sites of institutions for children in India that I'm comparing in different ways, and trying to, document and analyze.
The third sounds very challenging, but...
It was difficult, and I'm just now at the point where I've finished a fairly complete edit of the film I'm going to make from that material. It's going to be quite long, quite complex, and when I go back to Australia, I'll be working on the completion of that.
How do you edit? Do you have a professional edit suite, and do you use...
I have
Avid or something?
I use Final Cut Pro now on a Macintosh computer system.
At home or in the office?
It's at the university. I have an editing room next to my office, and I'm able to go in there and try to shut myself off from the rest of the world.
Turn your mobile phone off.
Yes. Now, I didn't have a phone in there for a long time, on purpose.
And do you want to say anything before we come to one or two theoretical things about the future or future projects? Or?
Well, only that the last bit of filming that I've been involved in, Judith and I went together back to Rishi Valley School, because I had much better access to the boys' lives than to the girls' lives, and I'd always hoped Judith would be able to come and do some filming with the girls. And also I think I get on better with the boys than the girls. And so the last time we went back, not for very long, a bit over a month, and she filmed a group of girls and I filmed a group of boys of the same age, so they're parallel. And we haven't even touched that material yet, except to log it and digitize it, but we haven't begun editing that material.
Right. Just because I kept you a very long time, but just one or two sort of wider thoughts about life. And perhaps this should be the last question, but it's occurred to me first, which is if you were now, I know the world has changed, but if you were now giving some advice to someone who was graduating in anthropology or film about the sort of project that you, or any techniques or any sort of fatherly advice to the young generation that you'd like to put on.
What would I tell them?
Yes, what would you tell them?
Well, I think I'd say, don't be afraid to start making a film if you don't know everything about the subject already. Because I think too many films are a kind of illustration of predetermined conclusions. And perhaps that's because, the classic way to do anthropology was to do your field work, to do your research, then to write it up as a separate publishable project. And I think filmmaking is very different, that the camera itself becomes, or potentially can be, a way of exploring your subject. And therefore I feel very much that films should be a process of research, not simply a sort of ex post facto publication of some previous research. Doesn't mean I don't think research is important, but I think that it's partly to do with the nature of the kind of knowledge that films can give you. That I think it's important to go into filmmaking in this way, in an exploratory way, because I think you learn things with a camera that you would never learn without one. Even if you don't actually end up maybe making a film at all. You may, simply because the camera gives you access and leads you into situations through which you learn.
I wouldn't have had this conversation with you without a camera.
Exactly, yes.
No, I absolutely agree.
Yeah. So that's one piece of advice. The others are fairly simple. I mean, I don't really enjoy technology for its own sake. I think it's a useful tool. We need to master it, but I think there's certain basic principles that will allow you to begin filming. For example, just being able to hold the camera steady. That's the first thing we teach in our video workshops. Just learn to hold the camera steady, find a frame of interest, and don't start playing with the camera. Let us see what's happening. Let us look at what you find interesting.
Very good advice. Any more?
Well, those are sort of fundamental, but...
Well, moving on to what seems to me something I got out of one of your books recently, and also seems to many anthropologists who've been taught to try and convey the complexity of other worlds through writing, and it's the theme of this conference you're just about to start. There's always supposed to be a tension or contradiction between the two forms of conveying knowledge and exploring the world, i.e. writing and filming. One very good at abstract communication through high-level symbols,
Mm.
and the other through direct, close association between the object you're seeing and the thoughts. And it's often thought that, you know, this tension is irresolvable. You're either going to have to go for the experience, the sensations, the emotions, and drop a lot of the more complex thought, or you're going to do the writing where you can convey that, but you lose some of the sensory experience.
Yes.
Do you think there is any way around this?
Well, to begin with, I don't think it's quite as clear-cut as that, because I think films can be, they can reflect complex thought in certain ways. I think what they're not good at is making propositional statements about the world. I think partly because they're dealing extensively with specific cases, and they don't have this ability to summarize from many examples. I mean, that's one part of it. But I think films can be highly analytical, nevertheless, in the way in which they explore their subject, in the kinds of juxtapositions they create, the kinds of lines of reasoning they follow. But I do agree there are some fundamental differences. But I think, you know, for one thing, you know, words are incredibly important in film as in writing. And words are used in so many ways, in conversations, and they're used in texts, in titles you could put up. Even the main title of a film tells you a lot about what you're getting into. And you know, through words we learn a lot about people's emotional lives as well as their intellectual lives. I think this was one of the things that attracted us to Lorang and the possibility of making a film about a Turkana intellectual in a way, or if not an intellectual, somebody who had thought quite deeply on certain matters. And I suppose there's a connection with children also. I find children have skills that we tend to underestimate as adults, intellectual skills, and by 12 or 13 they can understand 99% of what well-educated adults can if you talk to them about it, you know, in a reasonable way. So, you know, words are important, but by the same token, I don't like films to become absolutely word-dominated by simply being interviews or simply being having voiceover commentary with illustrative shots. I think the camera can be a kind of personal writing instrument, you could say, and a way of, as Edgar Morin, I think, said, a way of, you know, plunging into the world like a diver, and allowing other people to have the sorts of experiences that you've had, and conveying, you know, what it means to be living according to a whole set of assumptions and physical surroundings and principles and personal relationships that are often very, very difficult to communicate in writing unless you're a marvelous novelist like Tolstoy. And so I think I move from one mode to another often, and therefore films, I think, can also work in multiple modes and can layer these modes, because one or another approach is appropriate to one or another objective. And I think we have to use as many as we can, you know, use them as richly and effectively as we can.
I think that's probably a very nice point to end on. Is that all right?
Yep, that's fine.